All right, let's check this out. I know this is old news, but we're going to check it out again.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Government Innovation will now come to order and welcome a good afternoon. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess. Good afternoon. Late last year, the White Coat Waste Project exposed more than $10 million in taxpayer funds that were spent creating transgender mice, rats, and monkeys. These DEI grants funded painful and deadly transgender experiments that forced lab animals to undergo invasive surgeries and hormone therapies at universities across the country. For example, the Biden-Harris administration spent $2.5 million taxpayer dollars, $2.5 million taxpayer dollars to study the fertility of transgender mice. Let that sink in. We spent over $2 million studying the fertility of transgender mice. $1.1 million was spent to find out if female rats receiving testosterone therapies to mimic transgender men were more likely to overdose on a party drug, commonly used in the LGBTQ community to induce drug-fueled what's called, quote, chemsex. I asked my staff what was chemsex and the chemical, and I guess it's something called GHB, which is a date rape drug, and also a drug that's used recreationally. So we spent over $1 million to find out if female rats receiving testosterone therapy were more likely to overdose on a date rape drug.
That's crazy.
Like, that's what your taxpayer dollars were being spent on. Federal funds were also used to forcibly transition male monkeys to see if hormone therapy made them more susceptible to HIV.
Monkeys can't even get HIV.
Now, I didn't know this until recently, but monkeys cannot be infected with HIV. Yet this federally funded experiment forced them to take hormone-altering drugs to study a virus they cannot have. The Biden-Harris administration was so eager to propagate their radical gender ideology across all facets of American society that they were surgically mutating animal genitals. Like, taxpayer money went to that. So my question is, were they castrating mice, castrating monkeys? Were they getting double mastectomies? The language that they used in many of these experiments were, quote, gender-affirming care, which I learned about 3 years ago what that meant. I thought that was maybe just some hormones or something something like that, but apparently gender-affirming care is actually surgical mutilation of genitals, and apparently it's not just humans, they're doing it too. We were doing it with taxpayer dollars to animals. It's well known that because of the differences between animal and human biology, animal testing frequently does not produce results relevant for humans. In fact, 90% of novel drugs that are successful in animal tests fail in human clinical trials. Today's scientific questions are so complex that we have well surpassed a time where it is useful or appropriate to rely on inhumane animal experiments to answer them. Recently developed technological tools can more accurately model human biology and identify solutions that are more useful for human patients. But it is often the federal bureaucracy that prevents these new technologies from being used. Instead of adequately investing in these innovative alternatives, the federal government has continued to funnel taxpayer dollars towards cruel animal experiments. Today, most of the 27 NIH institutes and centers conduct or support animal testing, as does the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and countless other agencies. We have some beagle puppies here with us today. Beagle puppies have gone through some of the worst medical experiments. I mean, drugging them with cocaine, having insects eat at them and their bodies so much until they die, drugging them until they die. These are God's creatures, and they're beautiful, and you can see them sitting in the front row today. So we thank the folks who are here and brought these beautiful beagle puppies here today. In fact, the U.S. government spends in excess of $20 billion a year conducting experiments on animals. The White Coat Waste Project found in 2021 that the NIH, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a component of NIH at the time, ran by Dr. Fauci, spent $1.68 million force-feeding toxic drugs to beagle puppies between 6 and 8 months old before dissecting and killing them.
That's serious.
The conversation we're having today is important In 2022, due to public criticism lobbied against Fauci's NIAID by me and other members of Congress, another $1.8 million experiment to abuse beagle puppies in various drug tests was canceled. So I want to thank the work of White Coat Waste and everyone in the room today, others who've been on the forefront of this fight to end this sick and cruel and barbaric testing of animals today. Thanks to one of our witnesses, Justin Goodman of White Coat Waste. We have in the audience, I already know the beagles are here. The beagles are a reminder of the real cost of animal experimentation. So I'm looking forward to this conversation this afternoon regarding wasteful government spending on animal cruelty. And I also want to say, before I yield over to the ranking member for her opening statement, that this is a nonpartisan issue. Ironically, in oversight, while we might fight a lot in public, we are actually very nonpartisan here, and some of the most nonpartisan work in Congress comes right through this committee. So I want to thank the ranking member. Look forward to working with you. Thank you all for being here today. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Goodman, in your written statement, you state the White Coat Waste Project identified at least $10 million in NIH grants for transgender animal experiments. You state that 95% of the funding came from Dr. Fauci's NIAID. Why is the federal government spending taxpayer dollars to create transgender animals?
I'd like to know.
It's a great question.
Your microphone.
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, I wonder why they're making cats constipated also. It's a question that
That's fucked up.
rings around in my head at night when I'm going to bed, why we're funding these things. A lot of the programs that are funded do latch on to some type of social trend, and then animal experimenters use it as a money grab, as an excuse to get NIH tax funds from some, in this case, DEI grants were used to fund a lot of this stuff. So people who abuse animals find some kind of excuse to bring in new money, and they'll switch their research program over to something that's trendy to bring tax dollars into their university. I mean, that's part of the big problem here, is that colleges and universities are taking 25 to 40% off the top of every single one of these grants for indirect costs that go into a slush fund that has nothing to do with the research. So they're willing to let experimenters do whatever they want to animals to keep the money flowing in.
Some people might describe that as money laundering. All right, are sex change experiments that forcibly transition mice, rats, and monkeys necessary for science?
No.
Absolutely not.
Why do these experiments at all, if they aren't producing useful human relevant research, why again, you think it's a money issue, follow the money?
Animal testing is big business.
As you know, I've been long vocal about animal experiments and federal funded animal testing, and worked with you to prevent Fauci's plan to waste almost $2 million in taxpayer dollars to maim and murder beagle puppies, for example. Why was Dr. Fauci so insistent on poisoning these puppies, even though, as you state in your written statement, the FDA does not mandate that human drugs be studied on dogs?
So much of the problem with all of this is institutional inertia. It's that people just continue doing the same thing because that's what they've done before. There was a report that came out the National Academy of Sciences put out a few years ago about the VA's testing on dogs that Congressman Khanna actually helped us get the NAS to conduct. And they found that most of the VA's testing on dogs was unnecessary. And not only that it was unnecessary, but one of the reasons why is that there's this circular reasoning that they use to defend it when they propose a new project. They say, well, we used dogs previously, so we're just going to use dogs again. And there's no one to break that cycle. There's not enough oversight to say, hey, maybe we don't need to do this anymore. Maybe there's a better way to do it. It's like, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's kind of the problem.
Right. And what would have happened to these beagle puppies if if your organization hadn't rescued them?
In the case of those experiments, those dogs were going to be force-fed and injected with massive doses of experimental drugs to poison them to see at what point they got sick or died.
That's crazy.
And those tests will have no relevance for the safety and efficacy of that drug in human beings.
Thank you. Dr. Locke, I have a few questions for you. Can the scientific challenges we face today be solved by relying on animal testing?
No, not all of them.
Can you briefly describe how new technologies can allow us to transition away from animal testing without hindering scientific research?
Certainly. I also want to point out that in my written testimony, I do try to lay out a roadmap for how that could happen. But basically what we need to do is we need to spend a lot more resources supporting these non-animal technologies, such as organs on a chip and organoids, so we can use those to study many of the phenomena we're now studying in animals.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Baker, what are your thoughts today, reading your testimony for the opportunity to testify that it's long overdue? Where do we go from here? How do we fix the problem?
I think we fix the problem by investing in what is going right. We've got to cut a lot of this terrible animal research. We need to cut the National Primate Research Centers. We are funding these centers to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars every year. We've got to stop funding animal experiments outside the United States, as Mr. Goodman said, that have no oversight. We've got to stop. If you can meet your objectives without using animals, there's absolutely no reason that you should. And so,
I was going to say, thank you for bringing that up, the amount of money, the hundreds of millions. I recently found out in the state of South Carolina, in my district, there's a primate breeding center and testing site, Alpha Genesis. They've made, to my understanding, over $100 million from NIH over the last 20 or so years. This is a boondoggle. It is a racket. And hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, in fact, have been wasted on it. So I want to thank you all for your testimony today. Thank you for being here. I would now like to recognize my colleague, Ms. Brown, for 5 minutes.
Again, thank you to our witness.
Question, Mr. Goodman. What is the worst animal testing experiment you've ever heard of and uncovered? There's some really bad ones out there, but what is the absolute worst one you've ever heard of and uncovered?
The kitten cannibalism was pretty
That's fucked
horrendous. Breeding kittens just to force them to eat cat meat and then killing them even though they were perfectly healthy after they collected their feces out of a litter box. I mean, that's literally what was happening. They were doing that to thousands and thousands of kittens. The DOJ, until recently, was stabbing, shooting, and blowing up live animals for training exercises. We were able to cut that and defund that. The experiments that the NIH funded and Fauci funded in Tunisia, where they were putting the dogs and heads in mesh cages and filling them with biting flies. There's a lot of nightmarish stuff that we're being forced to fund, and taxpayers don't like it, and they don't even know how bad the situation is. If they did, they would be, marching in the streets.
Yeah, and Dr. Locke, a question for you. What are the prospects of a drug therapy that fails animal testing? Is it likely to receive regulatory approval?
Thank you for your question. I'm not an expert on the drug development process, but the way you've described things, I think if the drug would not make it through the tests that are required, it would not be able to be in the market. If I could just add, though, that Congress has really looked closely at this issue about developing drugs and has passed a law, the FDA Modernization Act, that removed the requirements for testing drugs. And my understanding is that there's bipartisan support for another law because Congress feels that the FDA is not moving more quickly in this area. That is the FDA Modernization Act 3.0 that would force the agency to really pay a lot more attention to using alternatives.
Okay, and then Ms. Baker, before I hand it over to Ms. Boebert, I love your idea of revisiting the Animal Welfare Act. I would be open to working with you in finding that language and doing a bill that would insert that language to define what an animal is. I think it's very important. I'm all about small parts, big difference. Of course, I would like to eradicate animal testing altogether, but that seems like an easy win that we could work on together in a nonpartisan manner. So I would love to talk to you about that, and I will yield the last 2.5 minutes to Ms. Boebert.
That shit's crazy.